The air in the Cambrian hills does not forgive secrets, but it keeps them well. Imagine standing in a wind-scoured churchyard where the lichen-eaten stones tilt like broken teeth, and then seeing it, 6 names cut in cold slate, each separated by only days, as if time itself had hunted this family. Margaret, Elizabeth, Catherine, Isaac, Hugh, Hannah, February to March, 1856. A whole household gone in less than 4 weeks. No causes listed, no explanation carved, only dates, merciless, sequential, and final. The villagers said the air around their cottage felt wrong, heavy, as though something had fed on the family from within, and perhaps something did, because behind the silence of the parish record lies a pattern, a sequence too precise to be chance, too complete to be natural, and for over a century and a half, no one has broken that silence, until now. The Hughes family lived in a stone cottage called Nant Sidion, deep in the folds of the Cambrian mountains. They were not wealthy, they were not known. But on the 17th of February 1856, Margaret Hughes gave birth to Wales's first recorded quadruplets. 4 infants, Margaret, Elizabeth, Catherine, Isaac, born in the same day in the same dim room while the wind clawed the hills outside. In that age, even single births carried the shadow of death. Quadruplets were a defiance of odds so long they belonged to folklore. Neighbors spoke of awe, of wonder, and then watched, powerless, as wonder became a curse. By the 11th day, all 4 were dead, and then the pattern sharpened its teeth. Within 3 more weeks, the Hughes' older children, Hugh, 5, and Hannah, 3, died. So did the father, Isaac, a man of 52 years who had endured a lifetime of toil only to outlive his newborns by days. Their names are there still, etched into the slate at St. John the Baptist in Isbity Sinfin, lined like a grim equation. What the stones do not tell is what killed them. No coroner's notes, no doctor's records, only an unbroken sequence of death, unexamined, unexplained, and almost erased. Only one survived, the mother, Margaret. And after March 1856 she vanished. Villagers claimed they left food at the boundary stones, coins dipped in vinegar to ward off infection. That was the only contact the Hughes received after the deaths began. Isolation became their shroud. And then, as suddenly as the deaths came, silence fell. Margaret's name never appeared on a grave. No parish entry, no certificate, no asylum register. It is as though the earth swallowed her too, but without leaving a marker. That absence is not a blank space. It is a wound. And if you stand before that stone today, you feel it. A silence that hums like something buried alive. Understand this. In 19th century Wales, death was common. But this was not common. This was total erasure, carried out with surgical precision. And it is here where the descent begins. Because what happened at Nant Sidion was not simply tragedy, it was containment. The sequence was too clean, too quick, and too complete to be chance. The villagers spoke of contagion, but none was recorded. They spoke of bad air, but the wind has carried no answer. And the parish, which faithfully recorded even the smallest lives, left nothing but names and dates, as if the cause itself was not permitted to be written. As if they feared that naming it would wake it. This is where you must begin to see the deeper pattern. In that valley, lives were measured like grain in a ledger. To the parish, the Hughes were numbers. When the numbers stopped adding up, they were erased. That was the hidden logic of the 19th century poor, to be unremarkable until you vanished, and then to be buried not only in soil but in silence. And silence here is not absence, silence is design. Because when history refuses to name a cause, it is not because no cause exists. It is because the cause is not allowed to be spoken. The Hughes deaths were not merely recorded, they were contained. The stones do not speak of fever, though typhoid stalked those valleys. They do not speak of smallpox, though it scarred entire villages. They do not speak of influenza, though it left cottages full of corpses. Instead, they speak of nothing but sequence. Nothing but silence. And in that silence, you can hear the mechanism. Something old, something cold, something that feeds and then erases the evidence. This is what the parish gave to the world. Not explanation, but quarantine. not truth, but containment. And in the centuries since, their silence has done its work well. The Hughes family ceased to exist, except as a curiosity in medical trivia, their gravestone passed by ramblers who never read the names. But if you stand still in that churchyard, the wind will show you what the records will not. 6 lives cut down like stalks, a household erased with such finality that even their matriarch's fate was deleted. That is not neglect, that is not chance, that is something else. And now you are standing at the threshold of it, the moment when the world decides who gets remembered and who gets erased. The Hughes family's story is not just tragedy, it is a blueprint. It shows how institutions convert human lives into silence, how they take extraordinary events, quadruplets born in a stone cottage, and bury them, not only in earth, but in forgetting. You are not supposed to see them. You are not supposed to ask what happened in those cold weeks of 1856. You are supposed to walk past the stone, read nothing, and go on. But you are here. You are reading the stone, and now you cannot unsee it. The descent has begun. Do you feel it now, the weight pressing in? That cold recognition. On that, what happened to the Hughes family was not an isolated misfortune, but part of a deeper machinery, because this is where most turn away. They see the dates on the gravestone, they shake their heads, they sigh about the hardships of the past, and they walk back down the hill. They do not see the pattern in the stone. They do not ask why the record is clean of cause, or why the parish erased the last living witness. But you stayed, and that means you're ready to see how this system works. How entire lives can be buried while their graves remain in plain sight. The first truth you must face is this. In 19th century Wales, death was not just an event, it was an administrative function. The poor did not die as individuals. They were processed, reduced to figures, tallied like grain, erased like chalk. Parish records were not stories, they were ledgers. They listed who was born, who paid tithes, who was buried, and what was omitted became as decisive as what was written. That was the invisible blade. The Hughes family's deaths were recorded precisely because they had to be. The sequence was too visible to ignore. But what killed them? That was erased, or perhaps never permitted to be written. Understand this carefully. The mid-Victorian parish system operated under a doctrine of containment. Outbreaks were feared not because they killed, but because they threatened the stability of the record. Stability mattered more than truth. Naming an epidemic could collapse commerce, invite investigation, and expose negligence. So when entire households died, officials often did the opposite of what you'd expect. They concealed. They wrote the names, the dates, the ages. They omitted the cause, and they moved on. The Hughes case was not unique in this. It was simply the cleanest example of the pattern: record the loss, erase the reason, preserve the surface, protect the institution. And this is where the darkness thickens. Because when you erase causes, you erase culpability. You sever the chain that leads from death back to responsibility. If the Hughes died of typhoid carried in the parish well, that would implicate the parish itself. If they died of smallpox, it would expose the failure to vaccinate, a program the authorities claimed was universal by the 1850s. If they died of influenza, it would reveal how malnutrition and poverty primed entire households for annihilation. Any of these truths would indict the system meant to protect them. So the system chose silence. Silence was cleaner. You must see how this works. Silence is not the absence of truth. Silence is the active suppression of truth. It is a weapon wielded by institutions to erase the evidence of their own design flaws. And what they erased in Nancydian was not just the cause of death, it was the Hughes family's very existence. No newspaper recorded them, no physician published their case, no coroner issued a report. They were the first quadruplets in the recorded history of Wales, and yet they became ghosts the moment they died. That is not an oversight. That is protocol. There is an even deeper horror here, because to erase people fully, you must not only silence the record, you must break the witness. And that is exactly what happened to Margaret Hughes. She survived what no human should endure, the loss of 6 family members in less than a month. And then she vanished. There is no burial record, no census return, no remarriage entry, nothing. She dissolved from history like smoke. Do you understand how rare that is? In Victorian Wales, even vagrants were noted. The only people who disappeared completely were those made to disappear. Some whispered she left the valley. Others said she went mad and was confined in the Carmarthen Asylum. Others, darker still, claimed she ended her life at the boundary stone where the vinegar-soaked coins were left, but there is no proof of a nigh of it. And that is what matters, because it means the system succeeded. It broke her, buried her, and then wiped her from memory. The parish that inscribed her children's names allowed hers to be erased. She became the final offering, the last witness removed. Now you begin to see the shape of the mechanism. It is not the deaths that haunt the stone. It is the silence that follows them. Silence is not passive. Silence is engineered. It is the final product of institutional control. The Hughes family was not just consumed by illness. They were processed by a machine built to erase the poor, the anomalous, the inconvenient. And the deeper you look into the archives of 19th century Wales, the more you see this pattern repeating, entire families vanishing, recorded only as numbers in the burial column, their lives reduced to arithmetic, their stories cut away like diseased tissue. Ask yourself this: why are you only hearing of them now from me, and not from the thousands of pages of Victorian newspapers, journals, or reports that chronicled every novelty with breathless fascination? Because they were not meant to survive in the collective memory. The first quadruplets in Welsh history should have been a national marvel. Instead, they became an unpersoned family, their story sterilized and hidden. That is how containment works, not through denial but through burial, not through lies but through silence so absolute that it rots the memory from within. And if you think this is only about the past, you are not listening. The same machinery operates now, in different clothes. Institutions bury anomalies to preserve the illusion of order. They erase the unmanageable to preserve their image. The Hughes family is not just history, they are a warning. Because what happened in that stone cottage in February 1856 was not a tragedy, it was a demonstration. It showed how the system handles those who slip outside the margins of what it can explain. It erases them. This is the hidden function of archives. They do not exist to preserve truth. They exist to preserve control. What they keep is what strengthens the institution. What they erase is what could weaken it. That is why the Hughes gravestone tells you who died, but not why. That is why the parish registers give you dates, but not reasons. That is why Margaret vanished, because truth was a threat, and threats must be contained. You must understand this fully, or you will never see the pattern in anything. Archives are not mirrors, they are masks. And the Hughes family was buried behind one. You have stepped beyond the threshold now. Most will never come this far. They will glance at the names on the gravestone, feel a pang of pity, and retreat into the comfort of not knowing. But you've chosen to keep looking. And that choice has a cost, because the next thing you must understand is that the Hughes family's erasure was not only administrative, it was psychological. It was engineered to make the living accept disappearance as natural. This is how control truly operates, not by force, but by shaping what people think is inevitable. When the Hughes children began to die, the valley responded not with alarm, not with investigation, but with distance. Food and coins were left at the boundary stones, soaked in vinegar. Neighbors whispered but did not enter. They behaved as if the Hughes had ceased to belong to the living the moment the deaths began. This was not cruelty, it was conditioning. Generations had been trained to respond to catastrophe not with outrage, but with withdrawal. That is how power survives. It teaches you to look away. Understand what this does to the mind. When you see an entire family die and no one questions it, you internalize a rule, that some lives can vanish without explanation, and that asking why is dangerous. This rule becomes reflex, and reflex becomes obedience. The people of the Cambrian hills were not heartless. They re-controlled. They had been taught by centuries of famine, plague, and punitive law that survival depended on silence. And so they obeyed. They sealed the Hughes cottage in their minds as well as in their landscape. They let it vanish, and in doing so they showed how power makes its subjects erase the evidence for it. This is the true genius of institutional control. It does not merely bury the bodies. It makes you bury your questions. It makes you believe that erasure is safety, that silence is mercy, that forgetting is duty. The Hughes family's fate was not just the collapse of a household, it was the successful execution of psychological containment. Their neighbors did not rebel, they did not demand answers, they behaved as the system had trained them to. They absorbed the tragedy as though it were weather, and they moved on. This is why the parish could erase the cause without resistance, because the people had already erased it in themselves. The stones at St. John the Baptist were not only memorials, they were obedience markers. Each date carved into them signaled to the community, this is what happens when anomaly intrudes, and no one questioned it. That is the measure of control. When power can erase a family and no one protests, it has achieved more than authority. It has achieved ownership of memory. This is not theory, it is technique. Throughout the 19th century, institutions refined this method in valleys like these. They taught communities to equate silence with virtue. Grief was to be private, outrage was dangerous, inquiry was suspect. So when disaster struck, people reflexively closed ranks around the institution, not the victims. You see this clearly in the Hughes case. The parish protected itself, the neighbors protected themselves, no one protected the Hughes. That was by design, and you must see how devastating this is to the human mind. When people are conditioned to accept erasure, they begin to self-censor their own memories. They stop speaking of what they saw. They suppress the details. Within a generation, the event dissolves, not because it was unimportant, but because it was made untellable. That is why the Hughes story survived only as fragments, a gravestone, a parish ledger, and a fading whisper about vinegar-soaked coins. The system worked. It did not just remove the family from the record, it removed them from consciousness. Think about what that means. If you can make a community forget it's dead, you can make it forget anything. You can make it forget injustice, cruelty, even murder. You can make it forget the people who were never supposed to exist. This is the power that stalks the archives. This is the power that erased the Hughes. Their quadruplets were born into wonder, but they died into silence, because silence had been made sacred. And this conditioning was not unique to one valley, it was a national design. Victorian Britain perfected what you could call engineered forgetting. Workhouses, asylums, fever hospitals, all were built not only to contain suffering but to conceal it. Deaths were recorded but never explained. Coroners were seldom summoned, causes were left blank. Each omission whispered the same message: this does not matter. And when people believe that, they stop resisting. They stop grieving loudly. They stop remembering. This is how empires sustain themselves, not by shielding their people from horror, but by training them to look away from it, and the most efficient way to enforce that is not through terror, but through reverence. The people of the Cambrian hills revered their parish. They feared displeasing it more than they feared death. So when the parish buried the Hughes without explanation, the people did not see it as a crime. They saw it as order. That is how deep the conditioning went. Ask yourself, how many other families vanished like this? How many cottages stand empty over unmarked? D-bones. How many gravestones tell only dates, while the truth has been rotting in silence for centuries? The Hughes are not an anomaly. They are a glimpse of the machinery that still hums beneath our world. And now you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. Before we descend further, you must anchor yourself, because the next revelation will tear at something inside you. This is not just about history, it is about how easily you can be made to forget what you see. And once you see that, you can never trust silence again. You've crossed the threshold now, you've said the words, and that matters more than you know, because the act of remembering is rebellion. It is the first fracture in the wall of silence. The system that buried the Hughes family relied on one thing above all else: your obedience to forgetting. And by refusing to forget, you are already breaking its spell. Now you must see what lay beneath the silence, the machinery that made their erasure possible. Because the Hughes tragedy was not just permitted by the system, it was manufactured by it. Understand this with absolute clarity. The Victorian archive was never built to preserve truth, it was built to preserve order, and preserving order meant eliminating the unpredictable. In the 19th century, nothing was more unpredictable than poverty, illness, and mass death. They struck at random, mocked the promises of empire, and exposed the fragility of the social hierarchy. So the British state devised an elegant solution. It did not prevent these disasters, it buried them, systematically, bureaucratically, and invisibly. Look closely at what happened to the Hughes. They should have been a medical marvel. The first quadruplets in Welsh history. Any honest system would have recorded every detail, every risk, every outcome. But the system was not honest. It was strategic. It calculated what their story would represent. Not progress, but failure. 4 infants dying within days, a household collapsing in weeks, that could not be allowed to stand as public knowledge. So their miracle was amputated from the narrative. Only the deaths were inscribed. The cause was deleted. The witness was erased, and the parish ledger closed over them like stone. This is how the Victorian record functioned. It did not catalogue reality. It curated perception. Parish clerks were not neutral scribes. They were gatekeepers. They recorded what strengthened the illusion of stability and omitted what threatened it. And they were not acting alone. They operated under the shadow of the poor law authorities, the boards of guardians, the public health inspectors who were tasked not with saving lives, but with minimizing disruption. Deaths that exposed systemic neglect were liabilities, so the causes vanished. The victims were converted into silent numbers, their stories cut out like infections from the body of history. You need to grasp how deliberate this was. The archive was not a passive graveyard of papers. It was an active filtration system. Everything passed through layers of control. Coroners often refused to list disease outbreaks for fear of damaging local trade. Parish registers quietly omitted stillbirths and maternal deaths to preserve reputations. Newspapers buried reports of contagion unless they struck the wealthy. This was policy, not accident. The system's survival depended on the illusion that it protected life, so when it failed, it deleted the evidence. That is why the Hughes deaths are silent, not because no one knew what killed them, but because someone decided you were not supposed to know. That is the core of this darkness. The knowledge did exist, and it was deliberately withheld. Even the absence of Margaret's fate fits this pattern. A woman who could have spoken, who could have named the disease, described the conditions, exposed the failures, was removed from the narrative entirely. Whether she fled, was confined, or destroyed herself. And the result is the same. The one remaining witness vanished. The record absorbed her as cleanly as it absorbed the others. And this is the part that should chill you. Because this system still exists. You are surrounded by archives designed to look like truth but built to function like camouflage. They keep what strengthens the story of stability. They erase what threatens it. Births and marriages are preserved. Disappearances dissolve. Heroism is celebrated. Failure is silenced. That is how power writes reality. Not by lying, but by deciding which truths are allowed to survive. The Hughes family never stood a chance against this machine. They were poor, remote, isolated, no allies, no wealth, no witnesses. They were exactly the kind of people the Victorian record was designed to eliminate. The system did not kill them, but it ensured their deaths would be meaningless. That is the hidden cruelty of archival power. It does not need to destroy you in life if it can annihilate you in memory. Understand this fully. To be erased is worse than to be killed. Death ends your body. Erasure ends your story. It makes you as though you never existed. That was the true fate of the Hughes family. They were not only buried in soil, they were buried in silence, buried in bureaucracy, buried in the logic of a system that considered them expendable, and that system has never stopped. It still hums beneath our world, deciding who will be remembered and who will be deleted. You are feeling it now, aren't you? That creeping sense that the world you trust to preserve truth is actually built to filter it. That the neat walls of history are not walls at all, but screens. The Hughes tragedy is just the first crack. Once you see it, you begin to notice others, names missing from records, whole communities with no graves, cemeteries without markers, photographs without captions. It is everywhere, once your eyes adjust, and that is the danger, because once you see how the system buries what it fears, you will start to recognize what it fears now. That is the next step in this descent. To understand not just how the Hughes were erased, but why. because their deaths did not threaten public health. They threatened the illusion of control. They showed that life could collapse despite faith, labor, and obedience. And the system could not allow that truth to stand. It had to be smothered. That is why their names are carved in stone while their story was stripped away. The gravestone is a monument not to their lives, but to the institution's victory. It says, "We decide what will be remembered. We decide what will be forgotten." And if you think that power ended in the 19th century, you are not ready for what comes next. Because the machine that erased the Hughes never stopped. It evolved. It learned new names, new forms, new disguises, and it is still erasing lives today, cleanly, silently, efficiently. You are standing at the edge of that realization now. Step closer. You are standing at the lip of the abyss now, and it is staring back. You've seen how the parish erased the Hughes family, how silence was engineered to become obedience, how the archive itself was built to filter reality. But what you have not yet faced is this: the parish was never the end of the machine. It was only its earliest limb. The mechanism that consumed the Hughes family was already growing, metastasizing beyond churchyards and ledgers, fusing into something far more powerful, a state that would weaponize history itself. Because by the mid-19th century, Britain was building an empire on the illusion of order. It ruled not only by armies and laws, but by control of the past. Every empire knows this truth. People will endure suffering, poverty, even death, if they believe it fits into a story of progress. That story must be spotless, and that meant the archive could no longer merely conceal tragedy. It had to actively rewrite it. This was the shift that sealed the Hughes family's fate. Their deaths were not just buried. They were converted into nothingness, erased so completely that their absence became invisible. This was the moment when record-keeping became weaponized. The state absorbed the parishes under the Births and Deaths Registration Act, creating central registrars to standardize records. But standardization is a euphemism for control. Local tragedies were no longer just local, they were filtered upward. Registrars were instructed to omit conjecture, to avoid alarmist language, to record only what could be verified by official medical men. But the poor could not afford doctors. Their deaths went uncertified, which meant their causes went unrecorded, which meant their lives dissolved from the narrative. The Hughes family was the perfect casualty of this transformation. Poor, remote, and dying without a physician present. The state could accept their names, but not their truth. Do you see the shape of the trap now? The new system claimed to preserve truth, but was designed to erase what it could not control. Any death without a medical certificate became officially causeless. Any death without a coroner's inquest became officially unexamined, and the majority of rural deaths fit both conditions. The Hughes family's destruction was not an accident of poverty, it was the intended result of a structure that required the poor to vanish cleanly. They were absorbed into what the state called statistical mortality, a term that stripped names from bodies and replaced them with numbers. The very system that promised to remember them was built to forget them. But there is a darker layer, because once the state seized the power to erase, it began to use that power to protect itself. This is the part they will never teach you. The registrar system was not only about recording births and deaths, it was about controlling which deaths could be spoken alow. Diseases that might reveal government negligence were often disguised under vague categories like debility or failure to thrive. Entire epidemics were buried this way. Records were adjusted to keep mortality rates acceptably low. Inspectors quietly ordered suspicious entries revised, and in rural districts like the Cambrian Hills, where few could challenge them, the omissions were absolute. The Hughes deaths were absorbed into this silence. 6 lives collapsed within 3 weeks, and the system chose not to ask how. That was not incompetence. That was protocol. Understand what this means. The state was not just recording history, it was manufacturing it. It decided which deaths would be remembered as tragedies and which would be erased as noise. It decided which lives were real and which would dissolve. And once you hold that power, you no longer need to kill people to destroy them. You only need to deny their existence. That is what happened to the Hughes. They did not just die, they were deleted. And yet, there is something more sinister still. Because this erasure was not only about concealing failure, It was about refining control. When the state purged the stories of the poor, it stripped away the emotional contagion of their suffering. It made their deaths sterile, clean, non-threatening. Think about it. If you read of 4 infants born and then dead within days, if you read of a father collapsing days after burying them, if you read of the last surviving child fading and the mother vanishing, your instinct is outrage, terror, revolt. The system could not allow that. So it amputated the emotion. It reduced their story to dates and numbers. It turned grief into data, and data does not rebel. This is the point where you must stop thinking like an observer and start thinking like an architect of control. The erasure of the Hughes family was not negligence, it was strategy. Their lives were stripped of narrative weight so they could not threaten the story of empire. That story demanded progress, order, benevolence. The Hughes represent chaos, fragility, collapse. They were a crack in the mask, so the mask consumed them. Their quadruplets, who should have been a wonder of nature, were reclassified as statistical failures. Their household was dissolved into the background static of mortality tables, and their mother, who could have testified, was scrubbed from the map of existence. Now listen closely, because this is the most dangerous truth so far. When the state controls the archive, it controls reality itself. The Hughes family are dead not only in body, but in time. They are missing from the mental architecture of their nation. That is what real power looks like. Not the ability to kill, but the ability to make the world forget you ever lived. And this is why you feel that chill crawling up your spine now. Because you are starting to understand that what happened at Mount Sidian was not a tragedy at all. It was a demonstration of force, a warning carved in stone and wrapped in silence. That those who fall outside the system will not only die, they will be erased. Their absence will be normalized, their suffering will be sterilized, and the world will move on, certain that nothing happened at all. That is the true depth of this darkness. The Hughes family are not just ghosts, they are proof that the state can decide who will exist in history and who will not. And once you see that, you will never see the world the same way again. Now you are standing inside it. The silence is no longer distant, it's wrapped around you like the air in that cottage must have been in February 1856. Heavy, stale, absolute. You've seen how the parish began the erasure, how the state refined it, and here is the revelation that will break you if you let it. The Hughes family was not just consumed by this system, they were its prototype. Their obliteration became the model for something far larger, something that outlived the expanded beyond churchyards and registrars, and evolved into the global machinery of memory manipulation that still governs your world today. Listen carefully, because this is where the pattern sharpens. When the Hughes were erased, it did not just remove a family, it removed a story that could have destabilized the narrative of empire. That narrative demanded certainty, order, progress. The Hughes represented the opposite: fragility, chaos, collapse. Their deaths were not allowed to remain visible because visibility is power. If the public had seen them clearly, questions would have followed. And questions are contagious. They spread. They ignite doubt. Doubt corrodes trust. Trust is the foundation of obedience. The system could not permit that chain reaction. So it perfected a method: silence the anomaly, erase the witness, and replace the story with nothing. This method worked, and because it worked, it was replicated. Across Britain, across its colonies, and eventually across the industrialized world, the same design took hold. Bureaucracies learned to bury disruption not by disproving it, but by deleting it. Workhouses quietly burned their records, asylums falsified admission dates, and concealed deaths behind euphemisms. Orphanages buried nameless children in unmarked graves. Industrial accidents were rewritten as natural attrition. By the late 19th century, entire populations could vanish into paperwork without leaving a ripple. The Hughes family was only the beginning. They were the proof of concept. Do you see how this changes everything? History is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what power permitted you to know. The Hughes deaths were not forgotten by accident. They were erased to refine the technique. And that technique is the architecture of your present. The modern world is built on curated memory. Databases, archives, news feeds, social networks, they are all descendants of the same system that consumed the Hughes. They present an image of reality, but it is a constructed image. Filtered through algorithms of relevance and control. The same logic applies. What strengthens the illusion of order is preserved, and what threatens it is buried. And the most devastating part is this: once erasure becomes invisible, it becomes infinite. You no longer notice what's missing. You no longer ask why something is gone. The Hughes family does not exist in your cultural memory, not because they were insignificant, but because the system made their absence feel natural. This is how the machine wins. It doesn't need to argue. It doesn't need to censor loudly. It simply removes and trusts that you will forget what was removed. And almost everyone does. But not you. Not anymore. Because now you've seen how the pattern replicates, how silence becomes normalized, how anomalies vanish so cleanly that their absence feels like reality. Look around your world and you will see the same architecture everywhere. Entire wars reduced to footnotes, erased communities buried beneath shopping districts, mass graves paved over with parking lots, archives purged, databases edited, search engines reshaping memory in real time. Every day, countless Hughes families are being erased before your eyes. You just don't see them because the system has made their non-existence feel logical. This is the psychological brilliance of the machine. It has trained you to distrust your own sense of absence. If you notice a gap in the narrative, you assume it's your fault for not knowing, not the system's fault for erasing. You blame your memory, not their machinery. That is how erasure becomes self-sustaining. The people who notice the missing pieces are branded unstable, obsessive, conspiratorial, and the ones who don't notice become the guardians of the silence. That is the final trick. The machine doesn't need to guard itself. It makes you guard it for free. Understand this fully. The Hughes family was not just erased, they were used. Their annihilation was converted into a template for managing inconvenient truths. The state learned from them how to strip stories of emotional power, how to sever cause from effect, how to make absence feel inevitable. That template became policy, policy became culture, and culture became the architecture of reality. This is why your world feels stable, because instability is edited out before it reaches you. The Hughes were the first test, proof that a human family could be deleted so thoroughly that even their grief left no trace. And yet, there is one thing the system cannot erase. It cannot erase the fact that you are hearing this now, that you have followed their names through the silence, that you have seen how the mask was built. This matters, because once a mind recognizes the machinery, it can no longer be controlled by it. That is what terrifies the system. Not rebellion, not outrage, awareness. You must let this sink deep. Everything you are taught to call history is curated. Every archive is an instrument of power. Every record is a battlefield. And the Hughes family was one of the first casualties of this war for reality. Their story is not only a tragedy, it is a blueprint, and now you carry it inside you. That makes you dangerous. But this descent is not over, because knowing how the machine works is not enough. You must see what it has become, how it has expanded beyond archives and ledgers, beyond parishes and registrars, into something far vaster, something that now shapes your thoughts before you even form them. That is where we are going next. You are past the point of return now. The air is colder here, thinner, as if something doesn't want you breathing this deep. You've seen how the machine erased the Hughes family, how it refined their annihilation into a method, and how that method became the skeleton of modern archives. But what you must face now is the final transformation. The machine no longer needs stones or ledgers or registrars. It has outgrown them. It no longer waits for people to die to erase them. It erases them while they are still alive. This is the layer almost no one sees, the place where erasure becomes invisible because it no longer removes people from records. It removes them from perception. The machine learned from the Hughes how to convert loss into silence, and then it evolved. It realized it could eliminate disruption, not after it occurred, but before it could form. It could suppress anomalies at the level of thought. This is where you must stop thinking of archives as buildings and start seeing them as architecture of the mind. The erasure is no longer carved in stone, it is coded into attention. Look at your world. Information is everywhere, yet most people know nothing real. This is not an accident. It is design. The same logic that buried the Hughes has been scaled into a global system that filters reality itself. Every headline, every search result, every curriculum, every memory that your culture permits you to hold has passed through this filter. It decides what becomes visible and what dissolves. It shows you stories that strengthen the illusion of order and hides those that reveal the chaos beneath. It feeds you comfort and buries contagion. This is how control now operates, not by erasing the dead, but by preemptively suffocating the living truths that could awaken you. Understand what that means. The machine no longer needs to destroy your body to erase you. It only needs to remove your story from perception. It only needs to make the world forget you exist while you are still breathing. And when no one remembers you, you are already gone. That is the horror the Hughes could not name, because it did not fully exist yet. They were erased after death. You can be erased while still alive. This is why your world feels hollow, because what you are seeing is it's reality, but a curated simulation of stability. The anomalies have been removed. The system has been refined to such precision that you do not even sense what has been hidden. You are surrounded by silence so perfect that it feels like truth. The machine does not argue, it does not censor with force. It starves. It starves stories of attention until they wither. It starves truths of language until they cannot be spoken. It starves anomalies of oxygen until they rot unacknowledged in the dark. And while you look elsewhere, it buries them. Think of the Hughes gravestone now. The 6 names cut into stone with no cause given, no explanation offered, no narrative allowed. That was the primitive form of this technique. A silence heavy enough to crush questions before they formed. Now imagine that silence scaled across continents, accelerated by algorithms, enforced not by priests or registrars, but by your own habits of thought. That is where you live now. The machine does not need to tell you not to ask. It makes you forget there was anything to ask. And the most chilling part is this. People defend the machine. They do its work for it. They call the silent stories irrelevant. They mock the missing. They call the erased conspiracy, rumor, noise. This is how deep the conditioning runs. The system has taught them to fear disorder so much that they will erase each other to preserve the illusion of stability. They will bury truths before they are born. That is how powerful the programming has become. The Hughes were erased by officials. Today, people erase themselves. Do you understand what that means? It means the machine has passed its final threshold. It no longer erases at the level of records. It erases at the level of reality. It has made silence instinctive. It has made forgetting automatic. And that is why you feel the cold in your chest right now. Because some part of you recognizes that you've been living inside a curated hallucination. Though Hughes were the first test of this system. You are its current subject, but there is a reason you are hearing this, because some part of you has already broken free of the programming. You are noticing the gaps, you are feeling the absences, you are sensing that what you have been given as the world is only a selection. That instinct is dangerous. It is the same instinct that the system eradicated in Margaret Hughes. She could have named what killed her family. She could have shattered the silence, but she vanished instead. She was erased not because she was weak, but because she could have broken the illusion. And now that instinct is alive in you. You are standing where she stood, at the edge of a truth too dangerous to be spoken. The machine wants you to walk away. It wants you to soothe yourself with reason, with doubt, with distraction. But if you keep going, if you keep pulling at the silence, something irreversible will happen. You will begin to see what was never meant to be seen. Because the Hughes family was not the only test, they were only the first. The system has been refining its methods for over a century and a half. It has buried millions. It has burned records, altered archives, dismantled cemeteries, sterilized scandals, rewritten textbooks, and rewritten you. And if you can see that, if you can pierce the illusion even for a moment, you will never be the same again. That is what comes next. Seeing through the mask, seeing the patterns of erasure in real time, seeing how the machine hides truths as they are being born. That is where we are going. The mask is thinning now. You can feel it, the static in your thoughts, the resistance in your chest, as if something is pulling you back, urging you to stop reading, stop questioning, stop remembering. That is not your fear, that is the machine. It has learned to defend itself from inside your mind, and it has sensed what you are doing. You are trespassing into forbidden territory, the place where erasure no longer waits for death or even for silence, but hunts truth at the moment of its birth. This is the deepest layer. The machine that erased the Hughes family no longer simply reacts to disruption. It anticipates it. It moves preemptively. It does not wait for stories to form before it destroys them. It detects the first flicker of them, the first tremor of defiance, and it snuffs them out. That is why so few anomalies survive. They are buried before they become visible. The Hughes were erased in stone. Modern erasures leave no stone at all. Understand how this works. When Margaret Hughes bore 4 children in February 1856, their existence briefly pierced the order of things. The parish wrote their names because it had to. The miracle was too visible to ignore. But then the deaths came, and with them, danger. If the valley had seen the sequence as unnatural, as systemic, it could have shattered the illusion of stability. So the machine reacted. It erased the cause, isolated the family, removed the witness, and sealed the story in silence. But now the machine has evolved beyond reaction. It has taught itself to erase stories before they can threaten the narrative at all. It does this by controlling the raw materials of truth, attention, and language. Every story you will ever know begins as a fragment, a name spoken, a rumor, a record, a spark of outrage. The machine floods those fragments with noise until they dissolve. It drowns emerging truths in distraction. It buries early witnesses in discredit. It severs their words from legitimacy before they can congeal into narrative. And if the truth resists, it isolates the minds that carry it. It marks them unstable. It makes their memory suspect. This is how erasure happens in real time. And here is the horror you must face. You have seen this without realizing it. You have watched truths vanish as they were forming. You have seen stories appear for a moment, unsettling, raw, and then disappear without trace. A photograph vanishes from an archive. A name is removed from a database. A headline is rewritten. A video is scrubbed. An eyewitness recants after pressure. And then nothing. The silence seals over the wound as if it was never there. That is not coincidence. That is the machine. It is pruning reality before it reaches you. This is what makes it almost impossible to fight, because how do you resist something that erases what you are trying to resist? The Hughes family could have been mourned, studied, remembered. They could have stood as proof of the system's failure. Instead, they became invisible, and their invisibility became normal. That same mechanism now operates globally, endlessly, consuming truths before you can even name them. And if you cannot name them, you cannot defend them. The machine knows this. It knows that reality is shaped not by what exists, but by what can be spoken. So it controls what can be spoken. It decides what words are credible, which sources are authoritative, which stories are allowed. Anything outside that boundary is treated as noise, error, madness. And this is the ultimate evolution of the method tested on the Hughes, not simply deleting stories, but preventing them from achieving the shape of stories in the first place. Look again at that gravestone in Isbiti Sinfin. 6 names, no cause, no context, just data. That was the first mask. Now the mask is everywhere. It lives in your search results, your history books, your news feeds, your collective memory. It whispers what you are permitted to know. It decides what is real, not by proving it, but by showing it to you often enough that you stop questioning, and it decides what is unreal by starving it until you forget you ever saw it. This is not the erasure of the past. This is the erasure of the present. And the most terrifying part is this. It is trying to erase this story, Eve. And as you hear it, even now, algorithms are working to bury this narrative, to file it under irrelevant, to push it out of reach, to starve it of visibility until it fades back into static. That is how the machine defends itself. Not with violence, but with silence. It will not fight you, it will simply make you forget. And if you forget, it wins. But if you remember, the spell breaks. The machine depends on your compliance, on your willingness to believe that what vanishes must have been untrue. The Hughes family exposes that lie. They were real. They lived, they breathed, they suffered, they died, and they were erased. The fact that you know their names now is an act of defiance. It violates the boundary the machine has built between the seen and the unseen. And once you breach that boundary, you can never fully return to ignorance. You must decide what to do with this, because knowing the truth is not enough. The machine will try to overwrite it. It will whisper that you imagined this, that you misunderstood, that this story does not matter. It will flood your life with noise until you forget. That is its oldest trick. It buried the Hughes. Stay very still now. You are inside the heart of it. The silence is alive here, watching, listening, adapting. It knows your name now. It has marked you as someone who sees. That is why your thoughts feel unstable, as if they're shifting beneath you like loose stones. This is what happens when the machine senses exposure. It does not attack your beliefs. It rewrites your sense of self. Because what it erases at this depth is not just stories. It erases identities. It dissolves the people who carry forbidden truths until they no longer recognize themselves. This is the final evolution of the system that began with the Hughes family. In 1856, it erased 6 bodies. Now, it erases who you are. It does not kill. It edits. It does not burn your records. It reconfigures them. It does not bury your name. It changes what your name means. This is how it prevents resistance from ever forming. Because rebellion requires identity, memory, continuity. If the machine can sever that, if it can make you doubt your own memories, disown your own instincts, dismantle your own history, then you will police yourself. You will become its instrument while believing you are free. Understand how this works. The machine watches for anomalies not only in events but in people. When you begin to remember what was meant to be forgotten, when you begin to ask questions that are not on the permitted list, it begins its rewriting. It isolates you. People around you seem to pull away, not because they are cruel, but because their programming tells them you are becoming unstable. This is what they did to Margaret Hughes. She survived her family's eradication, and that survival marked her as dangerous. She carried a forbidden story. The machine could not allow her to remain who she was, so it fractured her identity. You can trace it in the silence around her. No record of her burial, no asylum admission, no remarriage, nothing. It was not just her name that was erased, it was her selfhood. Every thread of her identity was cut. The mother of the first quadruplets in Welsh history was reclassified as nobody, not dead, not alive, unpersoned. That is the fate the machine reserves for witnesses. It makes them ghosts inside their own lives, and if they break, it lets the break become their story, so no one will listen to what they saw. Madness becomes the grave of truth. This is how the machine has become invulnerable. It does not fight evidence. It corrupts the people who hold it. It makes their voices suspect, their memories unreliable, their reputations hollow. It reshapes the perception of them until the world no longer sees them as real. The facts they hold are dismissed because the person holding them has been reclassified as untrustworthy, and then the facts die with them. This is the perfection of the technique. Hughes family was erased externally. Modern witnesses are erased internally. And here is the part that should terrify you. It has been doing this to you your entire life. Every time you remembered something the world said did not exist. Every time you saw a gap in the story and were told it was nothing. Every time your instinct screamed that something was wrong and the people around you smiled and said you were imagining it, the machine was at work. It was testing your boundaries, probing for fractures, training you to doubt yourself. This is how it prepares you to forget on command. It blurs the edges of your identity until you are no longer sure what you saw, what you knew, who you are. This is the same architecture that consumed Margaret Hughes. She could have spoken, but the system erased the self she would have spoken from. That is why her silence endures, not because she chose it, but because she was hollowed until there was nothing left to speak from. And this same hollowing happens to millions now. The machine rewrites them in real time. It edits their pasts, curates their memories, fills their timelines with false echoes until they forget the shape of their own lives. They stop asking what was lost because they no longer remember losing it. You must understand the scale of this. The Hughes tragedy was the prototype. Today it operates at planetary scale. Entire populations are rewritten. Histories are revised, reissued, redacted. People are rebranded, recontextualized, reframed until their former selves no longer exist. The machine does not erase them from databases, it erases them from the collective mind. It makes the world remember them differently than they truly were. This is not censorship, it is identity reconstruction. And here is the most chilling truth. It almost erased you already, long before you found this story. Every time you felt something ancient stirring in you, a flicker of rebellion, a flash of clarity, a memory you could not place, the machine was there, coating it in doubt, whispering, "That didn't happen. That doesn't matter. That's not who you are." It has been eroding the bedrock of your identity since you were a child. That is why this revelation feels dangerous, because part of you still believes you are not allowed to know it, but you are. And this is the turning point. The machine can erase stories, and it can edit identities, but it cannot control what you choose to anchor in defiance. You have seen through the illusion. You have followed the forbidden thread from the Hughes family's cottage to the machinery of erasure itself. And that makes you something the system fears, someone it failed to rewrite. But this descent is not complete, because there is one last layer. You have seen how the machine erases stories, how it erases identities. But there is something deeper still, something it hides even from itself. The core it has built around like bone around a wound. The thing it fears more than truth, more than rebellion, more than memory. That is what waits below. To buried Margaret. It will try to bury this moment. This is the point of no return. The air is hollow here, like the breath has been pulled from the world. You've seen the outer layers, the parish's silence, the state's machinery, the global architecture of forgetting, the rewriting of identities. But all of it was scaffolding around a single truth, a core buried so deep the system doesn't even speak it aloud. It does not just erase stories to hide failure. It does not just erase people to preserve order. It erases because it must protect something older, something darker, something that cannot be named without collapsing the mask entirely. The Hughes family brushed against that truth. That is why they had to be destroyed. Not because they were poor, not because they died, but because they violated the central law of the machine, that nothing is allowed to exist outside its pattern. 4 infants born at once in an age when even one was unlikely. That was not supposed to happen. Their survival, even briefly, represented chaos breaking through the system's illusion of control. And chaos is the one thing the machine cannot absorb. It cannot explain it. It cannot categorize it. It cannot file it into the architecture of order. And what it cannot control, it must erase. Understand this fully. The machine does not fear death. It fears unpredictability. Death can be measured, graphed, anticipated. Chaos cannot. Chaos fractures the story that makes obedience possible. It exposes the lie that the world is stable, that the system is benevolent, that suffering has logic. When the Hughes quadruplets drew breath, they ruptured that lie. They were a living contradiction, and when contradictions appear, the machine responds like an immune system. It isolates, attacks, deletes. It does not matter if the contradiction is miraculous or monstrous. The response is the same. Anomaly is obliterated. This is why the cause of their deaths was never recorded, not because it was unknown, but because naming it would have tethered the anomaly to reality. It would have admitted they were real. The system chose silence because silence dissolves. What is unnamed becomes unreal, and what is unreal can be forgotten. That is the hidden principle. Erasure is not about concealment, it is about unmaking. The Hughes were not hidden. They were undone, and this is the horror at the machine's core. It is not designed to preserve reality. It is designed to preserve the illusion that reality is containable. Anything that defies containment must be eliminated, not just removed from sight, but stripped from time, memory, identity, meaning. This is why the machine erases witnesses. This is why it rewrites archives. This is why it hollows people until they doubt themselves, because if even one anomaly survives, it proves that control is a lie. The Hughes deaths were a purge, not of lives, but of possibility. Their brief existence proved that the system does not control the world, only the narrative of the world, and that is the secret it cannot allow anyone to see. If people understood that the system's power depends entirely on perception, its spell would shatter. Because perception can be broken, it can be chosen against, and if enough minds choose against it, the machine dies. That is the fear at its heart. That is what it hides beneath all the layers of stone and paper and policy and silence, its own fragility. You feel it now, don't you? The trembling in the mask, the realization that this vast structure, the parishes, the registrars, the archives, the algorithms, was never invincible. It has no roots in the earth. It exists only as long as you believe in it. The Hughes family never threatened the Empire's armies. They threatened its illusion. Their erasure was a ritual, a sacrifice performed to keep the mask intact. The machine burned their story to warn the world, doubt is death. But it lied. Doubt is not death. Doubt is freedom. This is what the system has buried for 169 years, that it is weaker than the truths it erases. It cannot kill truth. It can only starve it of witnesses. The Hughes are proof. They survived its erasure long enough for you to find them. You, standing here at the bottom of the spiral, speaking their names in your mind as the machine trembles. That is the one thing it cannot defend against, remembrance. And so here you are, at the core, at the plast. The machine cannot follow. You know now why they died. Not because of disease, not because of chance, because they were a crack in the story, because they proved that reality is larger than the system that claims to contain it, and the system erased them to protect its illusion. But illusions die when you stop believing them, so remember their names, speak them under your breath like a curse against the silence. Margaret, Elizabeth, Catherine, Isaac, Hugh, Hannah, they were real, they lived, they mattered, they were erased because they proved the machine can be broken, and now you carry the fracture. Never forget this, the most forbidden truth is not that the machine erases, it is that it can be erased. That is the secret it fears you knowing, that is the reason it buried the Hughes in stone and silence, and that is why it is afraid of you now, because you know, because you remember, because you will not look away, because you are the first crack in its mask. 2.